Hello and welcome to another HanDrinksSolo wine info video, and today we are discussing Terracura's Smiley non-vintage white blend made by winemaker Groenewald. Now, at the sound of the words non-vintage, you might be outraged and declare,
"What the hell, man? What are you trying to pull?
Are you trying to pull a fast one?
This son of a bitch pulled the fast one!"
Or perhaps your response was less intense and just more puzzled, in the sense of,
I don't even know what that is.
but whichever your stance on the matter, I have a retort. Now, when discussing the concept of non-vintage wines in South Africa, it is true to say that over the last 40 years or so, non-vintage wines have been kitchen sink affairs, in that not only was everything thrown in but the kitchen sink, but also many of them ended up down the kitchen sink.
You see what I did there?
Because winemakers would take whatever leftover barrels and stuff they couldn't sell and mix it all together to produce a sort of bungling bottom shelf Venus banality that would be labeled non-vintage. But when the notion of a non-vintage blend is viewed through the lens of an artist, when it is viewed by someone inspired to produce greatness, then we see that actually non-vintage opens up an entirely new world of possibilities to the winemaker. Because now not only can the winemaker mix and match cultivars and fermentation vessels, but he can introduce and harness the effects of time on a wine as well. It's like telling an animator that he no longer needs to only dabble in 2D animation, but can introduce the third dimension into his creations. And if that little analogy is not enough to convince you philosophically of the merits of non-vintage wines, then perhaps it'll help to know that there are some fairly established wine categories, like Vin Jaune de Jura from eastern France, where winemakers lean pretty heavily into crazy oxidative winemaking techniques, and some of them end up with their wines being in barrel for over 5 years. And if even that is not enough to convince you, then perhaps go do some reading on producers like Radicon or Gravner, who've been making these rather bizarre wines for over 30 years. The reason I bring all this up is when I explain how this wine is made, you're going to think it's rather bonkers, and it may be helpful to know that these critically lauded producers were accused of being bonkers over 30 years ago and are now seen as pioneers and leaders in their field. But enough qualifiers, let's talk about the wine in the glass. At its simplest level, Smiley is a straight-up wine of origin Swartland Chenin Blanc. It's 86% Chenin, which means we don't even need to mention the 14% Grenache Blanc on the label. But the complexity comes in when we realize that the components used in this wine stretch across vintages as far back as 2016, all the way up to 2022. In fact, only 40% is from 2022, and the remaining 60% is from older vintages. We can then introduce another layer of complexity by mentioning the fact that some of those older components have been in barrel for up to 5 years, which is a pretty long time to be in a semi-oxidative environment. And if you thought that was sounding a little bonkers, we can take it further, because there is a 3% component that is made of maderized wine. Maderized wine referencing Madeira, of course, where wines are placed in barrel and then left out to bake in the sun for months at a time. The heat of the sun and then subsequently the cooling at night causes huge fluctuations in temperature, which puts all those oxidative processes on fast forward, often producing wines, as we said, that taste more like a sherry than a conventional table wine. And speaking of sherry, there is also 1% of the wine that has been aged under FLOR. Now, FLOR is a layer of yeast that can grow across the surface of a wine that's inside a barrel when the barrel hasn't been properly filled. This layer of yeast protects the wine from oxygen, but as a trade for its protection against oxygen, it also leaves all sorts of crazy flavors in the wine that can range from sourdough through to ginger spice. So given all the crazy components that are blended together in order to produce the Smiley non-vintage white blend, what can we expect from the wine in the glass? Well, the nose already informs us that this wine is a little left of center. Up front, we have elements of grapefruit and lemon peel, as well as some peach fruit and even salty sea spray. Now, this may not sound that unusual, but when you add to it elements of sourdough and ginger, then you realize there's something special going on. On the palate, we're greeted by some spectacular combinations of rather unusual flavors. There's the combination of some rather bracing tart green apple alongside some interestingly bruised yellow apple. Of course, there's also the citrus that we mentioned earlier, and those spice notes of pepper and ginger really come to the fore. One might go so far as to say there's a sort of tangy spiced apple cider character to it all. Finally, on the finish, there's some spectacular oxidative notes, which I think elevate the wine from unusual to epic, where you have salted nuts alongside more of that savory white pepper and ginger. Now, if ever there was a wine that is worth sitting with for half an hour or more, this is it. It's worth taking time to let the wine unfold in the glass and then using your knowledge of how the wine was made in order to make sense of the flavors that rush out of the glass to greet you. Well, that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed today's video, then subscribe to the HanDrinksSolo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month where we talk about wine history, wine science, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars like Chris Groenewald who are coming out of the South African winelands.